Ukraine advanced. And what it advanced with told the whole story of what 2 years of NATO partnership had built. Friday, 5:44 a.m., Donetsk Oblast. The lead element of the Ukrainian 33rd Mechanized Brigade crossed the line of departure 9 minutes ahead of schedule. 12 M2A2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in 3 staggered columns, each column separated by 200 meters of lateral distance to prevent a single artillery impact from destroying multiple vehicles simultaneously. Behind the Bradleys, 6 Leopard 2A6 tanks providing direct fire support from positions that allowed them to engage Russian crew-served weapons on the far side of the objective without entering the minefield that the engineering assessment had not fully resolved. Further behind, 2 PZH-2000 self-propelled howitzers on call for immediate suppression missions, operating from positions 22 kilometers to the southwest, already loaded with Excalibur rounds against the 4 highest priority targets on the brigade's no-delay fire list. Above everything, a TB-2 Bayraktar UAV feeding a real-time ISR picture to the brigade command post, the battalion command post, and the lead company commander's digital terminal simultaneously. The advance was not a charge into unknown terrain against an unseen enemy. Every position in the objective area had been mapped. Every fire mission had been planned. Every crew had rehearsed the scheme of maneuver twice the previous night. The 9 minutes ahead of schedule was not impatience, it was confidence. The confidence had a specific origin. The 33rd Mechanized Brigade had completed its NATO training rotation at a facility in Poland 6 months before this advance. The rotation had been 11 weeks. The first 3 weeks had covered individual crew skills on the Bradley and Leopard. The vehicle systems, the weapons employment, the maintenance procedures, the communications protocols. The next 4 weeks had covered collective training at the company and battalion level, combined arms coordination, fire support integration, defensive and offensive drills that assumed a NATO standard equipment package. The final 4 weeks had covered the operational planning process. How to build an operation order that integrated intelligence, fires, maneuver, logistics, and command and control into a coherent scheme that every element of the force could execute from the same document with the same shared understanding of the intent. The rotations training director had assessed the brigade at the end of the 11 weeks as performing at a standard that exceeded the NATO average for first rotation units and that placed specific companies. The lead company crossing the line of departure at 5:44 a.m. was one of them, at the level of proficiency where the system worked without supervision. The Russian defensive position the brigade was advancing against had been held for 4 months by a reinforced regiment whose operational posture the Ukrainian intelligence picture had mapped with the precision that 6 weeks of ISR collection produced. The regiment's forward line ran along a low ridge, 3.4 kilometers from the line of departure. The forward line was not the defensive strength. The defensive strength was the network of mutually supporting positions 800 meters behind the forward line. The second layer were the regiment's crew-served weapons. Its armored vehicle reserve and its artillery observation posts were positioned with interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach to the forward line. Breaking the forward line without addressing the second layer produced a force that had crossed a trench and was now inside a killing zone. The Ukrainian planning staff's scheme of maneuver addressed both layers simultaneously. Not the forward line first and the second layer after, but both at the moment of contact, using the fire's architecture to suppress the second layer while the Bradleys and infantry cleared the forward line. Subscribe to my channel and hit the bell. Every phase of this advance, the ISR, the fires, the infantry clearance, the armor overwatch, broken down completely at the level the news coverage can't reach. The PZH-2000 battery received its first fire mission at 5:46 a.m., 2 minutes after the lead Bradleys crossed the line of departure. The mission was against an armored vehicle observation post that the ISR collection had fixed at a specific grid in the second layer's northern section. The observer at that post had been reporting Ukrainian vehicle movements for 3 weeks. He had been reporting since before the brigade received its final operation order. The Excalibur round impacted 3 meters from the vehicle at 5:47 a.m. The vehicle was destroyed. The observation post went silent. The second mission was transmitted at 5:47:30 a.m., against an anti-tank guided missile position in the second layer's center sector. The round impacted at 5:48 a.m. The ATGM team abandoned the position before the round arrived. The observation post's destruction 19 seconds earlier had been visible from the ATGM position and had communicated that something was targeting the second layer with precision. The team that abandoned the position was still alive. They were also no longer at the position that covered the main approach corridor. What's your call? Type A if the simultaneous suppression of the second layer was the decision that most enabled the advance. Type B if the combined arms integration of Bradleys, Leopards, and PZH-2000 firing together was the more decisive element. Drop your answer below. The Bradleys reached the forward trench line at 5:59 a.m., 15 minutes from the line of departure. The forward trench had been under artillery suppression since 5:30 a.m. When the preparatory fires began against the positions the ISR product had confirmed as occupied in the previous 12 hours. The suppression wasn't designed to kill every position holder. It was designed to keep the position holders' heads below the parapet until the Bradleys were close enough that leaving the position was as dangerous as staying in it. Suppression buys time for the advancing force to close the distance where its own direct fire becomes dominant. The Bradleys' 25mm Bushmaster chain guns were dominant at the ranges they reached at 5:59 a.m., 400 meters from the trench. And the suppressive fire that had been running for 29 minutes had produced the condition that dominance required. Position holders who were in their covered positions rather than in their firing positions, whose situational awareness had been degraded by 29 minutes of incoming rounds, and whose coordination with the second layer's supporting weapons had been disrupted by the precision fires that had been targeting the second layer's communication-capable positions since 5:46 a.m. Ukrainian infantry dismounted from the Bradleys at 6:02 a.m., 150 meters from the trench line. The 150-meter dismount distance was specified in the operation order rather than left to individual crew commanders' judgment. The planning staff had assessed that dismounting at longer distances increased infantry exposure during the approach on foot, and dismounting at shorter distances reduced the time available for CV-90 crews to use the Bushmaster for last-minute suppression before infantry entered the engagement zone. 150 meters was the calculated balance between approach exposure and suppression time. The infantry moved at a crouch using the dead ground on the left flank that the ISR imagery had identified as below the sight lines of the trench's firing positions. Dead ground that the imagery identified was dead ground that the planning staff had incorporated into the scheme of maneuver. Dead ground that was invisible to the planning staff killed people crossing it. The ISR architecture that the NATO partner intelligence feed had provided made the difference between known and unknown dead ground at 6:02 a.m., 3 kilometers inside Russian-held territory. The trench clearance lasted 18 minutes. 2 Ukrainian soldiers were wounded, one by a grenade thrown by a Russian position holder who had survived the preparatory fires and the Bushmaster's suppression, and who died 30 seconds after throwing it from a second grenade thrown by the Ukrainian team clearing his position. One by shrapnel from a Russian 82mm mortar that had been firing from a prepared position in the second trench line 600 meters to the north. A mortar that the ISR picture had assessed as likely present, but whose exact firing position had not been fixed with the precision required for an Excalibur mission. The mortar fired 4 rounds into the trench clearance area before the TB2 operator overhead fixed the firing position and passed the grid to the fire direction officer. The 5th and 6th rounds were in the air when the Excalibur round impacted the mortar position. They were the last rounds that mortar fired. The Leopard 2A66 had been operating in overwatch throughout the infantry phase. Hull down on a slight rise 900 meters behind the Bradleys, their thermal sights and commander's panoramic sights scanning the second layer for armored vehicle contacts. 2 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles emerged from covered positions in the second layer at 6:08 a.m. and began moving toward the forward trench on a route that would have reached the trench before the Ukrainian infantry clearance was complete if they had moved 2 minutes earlier. They had not moved 2 minutes earlier because the second layer's communication-capable observation post had been destroyed at 5:47 a.m., and the BMP-3 crews had been waiting for an updated picture that hadn't arrived because the post that would have provided it was burning. The delay was 6 minutes of ambiguity about the situation in the forward trench, produced by one Excalibur round at 5:47 a.m. One Leopard engaged the lead BMP-3 at 1,400 meters with a DM-12 heat round. The vehicle was destroyed. The second BMP-3 turned back toward covered ground. The Leopard's commander tracked it through his panoramic sight as it moved, maintaining a targeting solution at ranges up to 2,100 meters before the vehicle reached terrain that broke the sightline. It did not emerge again during the operation. The logistics vehicle that was struck by Russian artillery at 6:31 a.m. was a factor the planning staff had anticipated and had built a redundancy for. The strike killed the driver and destroyed the vehicle's cargo, 150mm ammunition for the PZH-2000 battery's second sustained fire allocation. The redundant ammunition vehicle 800 meters behind it was undamaged and reached the battery position at 6:51 a.m. The battery's fires rate had slowed for 20 minutes. It had not stopped. The planning staff's decision to position the ammunition vehicles with 800 meters of separation rather than in convoy had been specifically driven by the assessment that Russian artillery would target the most visible logistics movements in the brigade's rear area during the active phase. The 800-meter separation was the mitigation. It cost one driver his life and delayed the ammunition resupply by 20 minutes. The original planning assumption had been that a column strike could delay the resupply by up to 40 minutes. 20 minutes was within the planning tolerance. The armored recovery vehicle that moved forward at 6:45 a.m. to recover the Bradley that had been immobilized by an IED at 6:12 a.m., the only vehicle loss of the advance, was an M88A2 Hercules, specifically capable of recovering an M1A2 or Bradley under fire at weights that lighter recovery vehicles couldn't manage. The M88A2 had been delivered in the same equipment package as the Bradleys and had been trained on by the brigade's maintenance company during the NATO rotation. The Bradley immobilization had been assessed by the crew as repairable within 6 hours at a maintenance point, rather than requiring evacuation. The recovery vehicle towed it to the maintenance point established in the cleared area behind the forward trench at 7:15 a.m. The crew of the recovered Bradley was uninjured. They were back at the maintenance point being briefed on the vehicle's damage assessment while the advance's exploitation phase was being organized. They asked to be back in a vehicle before the exploitation launched. The answer was yes. The exploitation phase launched at 7:30 a.m., 1 hour and 46 minutes after the line of departure crossing. The objective of the exploitation was a terrain feature 5.4 kilometers north of the forward trench that provided observation over the Russian brigade's primary logistics route, an elevated position from which Ukrainian fires could interdict the route without the route interdiction HIMARS strike that a deeper exploitation would have required. Controlling the elevated position was an economy of force solution. Use the ground to see the route, use smaller caliber observed fires to interdict traffic on the route, reserve the HIMARS allocation for targets further into the depth that ground observation couldn't reach. The brigade commander had made the elevation control decision specifically to extend the operational effect of the advance beyond the forward trench clearance without consuming the core level fire's resources that a deeper advance would have required. The Ukrainian advance reached the elevated position at 9:11 a.m., 1 hour and 41 minutes of movement through terrain that the ISR picture had characterized and the exploitation force had navigated using the digital maps derived from that characterization. The Russian security element on the elevation, a reinforced squad with 2 crew-served weapons, had been reduced to 1 crew-served weapon functional by the time the exploitation force's lead Bradley crested the approach slope. The second crew-served weapon had been destroyed by a UAV-directed precision fire mission at 8:47 a.m. when the TB2 operator identified the position and the fire cell processed the mission in the digital system. The crew-served weapon that remained engaged the lead Bradley at 300 meters. The Bradley's 25mm Bushmaster suppressed the position in 4 seconds of directed fire. The infantry dismounted and cleared the elevation at 9:18 a.m. The logistics route was visible from the crest at a range of 3.2 kilometers. A Russian supply convoy of 6 vehicles was observed on the route at 9:24 a.m. The forward artillery observer with the exploitation force called the fire mission at 9:14 a.m. The first PZH-2000 round impacted the convoy at 9:25 a.m. 3 vehicles were destroyed. 2 turned back. 1 pulled off the route into cover. The logistics route was effectively closed at 9:25 a.m. What would you do as the Russian regimental commander, receiving reports of your forward line cleared, your second layer suppressed, your BMP-3 reserve vehicles turned back, and your primary logistics route interdicted from an elevation you didn't defend with enough force? Comment your decision below. The digital command and control systems that had connected every element of the advance, the TB2 ISR feed, the digital fire missions from the AN-TPQ-37 to the PZH-2000, the targeting data from the Leopard commanders to the fire cell, the route characterization from the intelligence picture to the exploitation force's digital maps, were the invisible layer that the advance had operated inside without ever being visible in any photograph or news report. The systems had been delivered by NATO partners across multiple tranches of technical assistance. They had been integrated by software teams working at Ukrainian operational headquarters. They had been trained on by signal officers at the NATO rotation facility and by the digital systems operators whose positions were the most operationally critical and least publicly recognized roles in the brigade's structure. The digital layer that had allowed a fire mission to be processed in seconds rather than minutes, and a target to be visible to the brigade commander, the battalion commander, and the lead company commander, simultaneously was the layer that had made every other layer work at its potential. A Bradley without the ISR picture that told its crew which direction was safe to dismount is a Bradley that loses soldiers to avoidable exposure. An Excalibur round without the digital fire mission architecture that transmitted the grid in 11 seconds is a precision weapon that arrives after the opportunity has closed. A Leopard overwatch without the real-time TB2 feed that showed the BMP-3 movement 6 minutes before it reached the trench is a tank that engages reactively rather than proactively. Each system was dependent on the digital architecture that connected it to the others. The digital architecture was the multiplier. The systems were the capability it multiplied. The 33rd Mechanized Brigade's advance of 9.1 kilometers from line of departure to the elevated observation position over the logistics route had been completed by 9:18 a.m., 3 hours and 34 minutes from the first Bradley crossing the line of departure. 1 Bradley immobilized and recovered. 2 Ukrainian soldiers wounded, both evacuated, both assessed as surviving their injuries. 1 logistics vehicle destroyed. 1 Russian armored observation post, 2 ATGM positions, 2 BMP-3 IFVs, 1 82mm mortar, and 1 regiment's logistics route closed. The operations fires had been processed through a digital system that averaged 11 seconds from mission transmission to battery confirmation. The ISR picture that had shaped every decision had been refreshed by the TB2 every 40 seconds throughout the 3 hours and 34 minutes. The Excalibur rounds had averaged 3.6 meters from their designated aim points. Don't miss the follow-up breakdown on how the logistics route interdiction developed over the 48 hours after the advance, and what the Russian regiment's resupply situation looked like with its primary route under observation. Subscribe to my channel and hit that bell. Advances are measured in kilometers and hours. The 9.1 kilometers and the 3 hours 34 minutes were the numbers. They didn't capture what produced them. What produced them was a brigade that had spent 11 weeks at a NATO facility learning a different way to plan, to coordinate fires, to integrate ISR into tactical decisions, to use digital systems as connective tissue between every capability element rather than as a supplementary tool. The learning had been applied to equipment delivered and integrated across the months between the rotation and the advance. The equipment and the learning together produced an operational standard the Russian regiment had not been prepared for. Not because the regiment was poorly led or poorly equipped by its own standards, but because the standard it was facing had been built to a different specification. The 9 minutes ahead of schedule at 5:44 a.m. was the confidence expressing itself before the first shot. The 3 hours and 34 minutes that followed was the confidence proving itself accurate. The 9.1 kilometers on the map at 9:18 a.m. was what the system working looked like in ground. Was the advance's success primarily a product of the NATO equipment that armed the brigade, The Bradleys, Leopards, Excalibur, digital systems? Or did the NATO training rotation that changed how the brigade thought, planned, and executed matter more than the hardware? Type E for equipment was the primary driver. Type T for training and doctrine drove the outcome. Make your case below. NATO equipment helped Ukraine advance. The more accurate statement is specific. NATO equipment, integrated through NATO standard digital architecture, employed by crews trained to NATO operational doctrine, guided by an ISR picture built through NATO partner intelligence, sustained by a logistics chain built across 22 nations, and commanded by officers who had absorbed a planning process that connected every element through a shared document in a shared digital picture. That combination helped Ukraine advance. Removing any one element reduces the outcome. Removing the equipment removes the capability. Removing the doctrine removes the method of applying it. Removing the training removes the proficiency that makes doctrine work under pressure. Removing the ISR removes the picture that makes precision possible. The combination was the contribution. The advance was the proof. If this breakdown delivered the analysis you came here for, like the video, share it, and subscribe to my channel. Every phase of this advance, every system, every tactical decision, we build it out completely. Which element of the NATO contribution to the 33rd Brigade's advance do you think was most decisive? The equipment, the training, the ISR architecture, or the digital fires integration? And what does the Russian regiment's operational picture look like after losing its forward line, its second layer suppression, and its logistics route in a single morning? Drop both answers below.